Welcome, everybody. Great to see you all here. I'm Peter Askim. I'm the artistic director of the next Festival of Emerging Artists, and we're in the middle of a 4-week festival of online guest speakers, master classes, sessions. Every Tuesday and Thursday, we're bringing these to you for free. We're really excited about a lot of the artists that we've had. We have 2 weeks of events coming up. Please do tune in. Today is an especially amazing day. In addition to Rob, who you've tuned in to see, we also have Flutronics and James Dargan and Anthony Davis, who is the Pulitzer Prize winner for 2020 and a former teacher of mine. It's a great honor to have him. And then tonight we have an incredible workshop called Miraculous Futures. So I encourage you to sign up for all of those. We're just having them back to back to back. It's an embarrassment of riches today, especially. But do join us the rest of this week and next week for incredible events. So humbled and so excited about all of the people who are joining us, and so glad that you can be a part of it. We've been doing this since March. We're in the middle of a festival, but we've been doing something called Next Fest Connect since March, bringing you great guest artists every week. So if you're able to make a donation and support us, that we would love that. We're in the middle of trying to pay for all of this and want to provide it for you for free. But we're all here to talk with Rob Deemer and the Institute for Composer Diversity. Rob and I have known each other for a very long time. In addition to being a wonderful composer, Rob founded this great project to make it easier to find works by important composers. And I know in my own work as a conductor trying to do programming, sometimes it's really difficult to find materials and information about composers who are not as well represented in the concert hall. And so it's a particular pleasure of mine to have Rob on to talk about ways that it can be easier to make this a regular part of our programming and not something that we do as just sort of an extra thing, but just how we think about putting together programming every day. So I'll turn it over to you, Rob. Great to see you.
Peter, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be the opening act for what sounds like a wonderful day with a lot of fantastic people. It sounds like y'all are going to have a real treat today. So today, I'm going to be introducing you to a project that I started about 4 years ago this summer called the Institute for Composer Diversity. Tell you a little bit in terms of how it got started, and then what it is, and why you might be interested in using some of our resources, and then kind of taking you through a little bit in terms of some of the stuff that we've found over time, over the last year and a half, as we've looked at, for instance, we did an analysis of orchestral seasons last year, and we're continuing to do that this year, but it'll kind of give you a sense in terms of what the picture is, at least in the orchestral world, and then we can extrapolate out from there. So, excuse me, and I do have a fancy little presentation here that you can, will share the screen with here, and if I can get all of these folks to actually let me show it. Oh, come on. I love Zoom so very much. Okay, so as I said, this is just going to be a brief introduction in terms of this project, and then we'll go through a number of different ideas in terms of what is in our database resources and our analytical resources, and then talk a little bit about best practices. So about 4 years ago, I had the idea of creating a spreadsheet for my students. I teach here at the State University of New York at Fredonia, which is in Western New York, just outside of or just on Lake Erie. And I had this idea of, I've always wanted to be able to make it easier for my students to be able to provide or to be able to find women composers if they were looking for music to research or to perform. And at the time, that was a focus of mine, and so I thought, we'll make a list, and we'll not only allow folks to be able to search by their names or by the hyperlinks to their websites, but it would be also useful to be able to search by things like whether or not they're living or deceased, where they happen to be living, the different kind of musical genres that they would be writing in, and also what their racial and ethnic demographics were. Fast forward about a year and a half, so now we're at the beginning of 2018, and I actually put out, this is a picture of what the thing looked like when I actually made this public. It was the Women Composers Database, and it was basically a public Google spreadsheet that got a fair amount of attention for what it was, it being a spreadsheet, but it seemed to be useful, and so I took that and expanded it. We actually included not only women composers, but then also all composers of color as well, since we already had female composers of color within it. And then we created the website, which is thecomposerdiversity.com, and then we put out in the summer of 2018 something called the Composer Diversity Database, which was basically just a searchable database, web-based, that you could find composers by all of these different search components. Fast forward another 6 months, and I was able to convince my colleagues here at the university that this would be something that it would be good to be able to have something more than just a database, but to be able to have something to actually advocate for the performance of composers from underrepresented groups, women composers, composers of color, LGBTQIA2+ composers, and disabled composers. And so that's how we got the Institute for Composer Diversity, which launched in January of 2019, and we've been going for about a year and a half. So it's still very, very young, but we still have a lot of resources at our disposal, and those are growing by the day. The first one, as I mentioned, is the Composer Diversity Database, which is basically you just go to the site and you can punch in, and actually I'm going to get out of that for just a second so I can actually show you the site live. So this is what the site looks like, and if we wanted to go to the Composer Database, we just go here, and then you can actually go through and punch someone's name in if you're looking for someone specific, or you can look for composers, whether or not they're living or historical, women, non-binary, LGBTQIA2+. We've got several different genre criteria that you can search for, as well as subgenre, these chamber versions, to be able to find the composers who have composed those works, as well as demographic criteria and where they happen to be living. Whether or not, so let's say if you happen to be in Cincinnati, Ohio, you can look up composers that are either in the United States or in Ohio or in Cincinnati, and to be able to find composers that way. And what I've always found is we have about, I think, over now 4,300 composers in the database, which is a lot, and these composers range from Pulitzer Prize winners to folks who are probably still in undergrad or graduate school. So it's a wide range of composers, but at least it allows folks to be able to find composers that happen to be writing in certain genres or living in certain areas. And what I've always found is that many times if someone will just click just one box, the search may give you several hundred names. And so what that might allow for us to do, that can be difficult to be able to focus. So I'll go back to the presentation a little bit and show you that that's what it actually comes out to be. This is what the search results look like. And then my suggestion when folks are using it is to actually use several of the different types of things, whether or not it's genre, demographics, location, so on and so forth, in order to shrink the number of composers that you're looking at. And then you can always, this is what I love about this, you can always download that search. So let's say if you're looking for string quartets, you could look for composers who've written string quartets, and you could just say do black composers, and then you can just do say living women composers who are Latinx, and you can come up with any number of different searches, and then save each one of those searches as CSV files, which then will allow you to be able to open it up in Google Sheets or Excel, and then you've got that information in case you're looking for it. In addition to, so that was the first project, the Composer Diversity Database. It also, we found out very, very quickly that folks weren't just looking for composers, but they were really looking for music. They wanted to be able to find works that they wanted to be able to play or conduct or study. And so then we created the Works Diversity Database, which looks like this. It's fairly similar to the other one. Now, this particular one, it's a little bit different because we have to focus. We had to start with a certain genre. We actually started with wind band, and then we've incorporated orchestral and art song. And we're actually currently building a chamber music database and a choral database. So hopefully in the next year or so, because there's going to be a lot of chamber music, not to mention the choral music, but this will allow for you to be able to search for, say, a work for oboe, and you can say, I want a sonata for oboe and piano, or let's just say a solo work for oboe and piano. It needs to be 10 minutes long, and I'd love for that to be a living composer. Click, 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 and then boom, the results you'll be able to find works that fit like that. And this is what the results look like. Obviously, I mentioned most of these are orchestral and band works, so that's what we're looking at here. And the wonderful thing about this that I really like is not only can you also search and save the data, save the search results that you get, but also you can find not only the composer's website, but hopefully, if they've made it, a page specifically geared towards that piece. Now, sometimes that will mean just an informational page on a composer's website, but many times it will also be the page where you can actually purchase that work. In addition, we also have, when we can find them, links to either audio or video links, so you can actually listen to it. So if you wanted to listen to one of these orchestral works by Keiko Abe, you can go listen to that on Spotify or find it on YouTube, and then go find the work on the web page. So it's fairly sizable. We have, what is it now? Over 2,500 works, I think, for wind band, and over 11,000 works, or almost 11,000 works for orchestra, and over 1,600 works for art song. And I know that, like I mentioned, we're working on a chamber database that I think we're easily over 2,000 works, but that one's probably going to be more like 20 to 30,000 works. If you can imagine 4,300 composers and how many chamber works they've composed, it's going to take some time to get all of those things together. And that will be anything from, say, a solo unaccompanied work all the way up till 11, 12 player ensembles. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I think that will kind of just exponentially increase the impact that our resources have on the music industry. Let's keep going here. I also mentioned that in addition to providing these database resources, which are really useful just to be able to find composers and find works by those composers, it's also good, I've found, to be able to look at what's going on in the world and at least provide some what's the best way to put it? Some objective data to make sure that folks kind of understand why this is important. Because it's one thing to just say you need to diversify your repertoire, but I think it's tricky because you can kind of miss the point. People tend to or I have found that there's always the risk that folks will consider it something that they have to do rather than they want to do, and that they will put themselves into the mindset that, oh, as long as I can check a box and I can just say, oh, look at that, I have just enough diverse composers or composers from diverse works groups that are doing this. Well, then that's fine. Then I've done my job, and now I can go back to focusing on Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms and all of the usual suspects that we'll talk about in a bit. But really, what I've found is the more, instead of anecdotal data, which is how a lot of people tend to think, it feels like, let's say, an orchestra or wind band or a choir may feel like they are performing a lot of works by underrepresented composers. Oftentimes the data shows otherwise. So almost a year ago, or over a year ago, back in February of 2019, I started looking at orchestral seasons. Started initially with the Big 25, which is the top group of League of American Orchestras budget group, that they kind of how they categorize the different orchestras in the country, and actually went way past that. So it wasn't just 25. I actually got up to 120. So I looked at 120 orchestras from around the country, and this is just American orchestras for right now. Hopefully we will be able to include other countries as well, but we had to start somewhere. And basically I decided to look at their classics seasons, or some of them call them masterwork seasons. Decided to hold off on looking at children's concerts, film music concerts, new music concerts, chamber concerts, pops concerts, all of the other things that orchestras do, and just look at the classic series so we could at least get an idea of what that looked like. And that's what I found. And I will get a little bit bigger here so you don't have to squint, because you probably wouldn't be able to read that anyway. But you can at least see from the side that there are still quite a few, and these are just works by women composers. I have a similar graph on our site of percentage of works by underrepresented composers from underrepresented heritages. But as you can see, quite a few orchestras had no women whatsoever, and quite a few other orchestras, their seasons were basically 1% to almost 10%. And then up here at the top, you had about, 20, 45 orchestras that had 10 to 32% of their season were included works by women composers in this particular graph. And I'll show you that's kind of what this looks like. Now, the idea of looking at percentages, and I'll explain what these numbers mean, but the idea of why to focus on percentage of works is that one of my big concerns was, how do you compare, say, the New York Philharmonic with a very small orchestra? How do you get an apples to apples comparison? And so one of the things that I decided to do was, to make sure that we were just looking at those classic series, because that's something that every orchestra has. Chamber series, new music series, those are great, but there aren't that many orchestras that have them. And so then that would give you a skewed result. At the same time, you also want to make sure that some orchestras can repeat their performances numerous times. Some will have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, same concert. Some will just have one. And so it wasn't the number of performances that I was looking at, it was how many programs, and we'll get into this a little bit, how many programs were these works on. So didn't matter how many times those programs were being performed, but if you had, say, a program in October, and let's say, I don't know, Mozart Symphony No. 40 was on that concert, they would get a 1. We would put 1 in the spreadsheet. If they happened to perform that work again in April for whatever reason, because it was a really good year for Mozart 40, then we would put 2. But for the most part, that was because that would be a different program altogether. But for right now, you can see that this is how we were able to make this work. So what do I mean by all of these numbers? And I apologize, there is a bit of math here. I am not a math person. I've never really thought of myself one. I've kind of learned how to be able to do this over time. But this is a way for us to be able to kind of demonstrate how folks are doing things. And so these numbers here, over here on the left-hand side, you have the first number, and that is the League of American Orchestras budget group. So number one are the top, the most well-endowed orchestras with the largest budgets and the largest seasons. So you've got your Los Angeles, your Chicago, your New York's, all of that. All the way down to group 5. There's actually, I think, 9 groups, but I kind of had to stop it at 120 because that was a lot of orchestras. And I kind of figured that out, after 120, we were able to at least get a decent picture of where things were. And then the other numbers on the other side of the orchestra's name is how many works, how many programmed works out of the total programmed works were works, in this particular case, by women. So the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra, or ROCO, as they like to be called, had 10 works in the 1920 season out of 31 that were by women composers. And Albany had 9 out of 28, and so on and so forth. Now, I should also mention, just to be totally transparent, these were numbers that we did last summer or last year when we were analyzing the concert announcements that had been made public. Obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the spring seasons for many of these orchestras were truncated or adjusted in some form or fashion, and so the numbers reflect what reality would have been without pandemics. But my guess is that there were a number of works that weren't, and I actually know for a fact, I've seen people over the last 3 or 4 months basically say, I was supposed to have a work being performed by the Boston Symphony or the New York Philharmonic, and now we have to wait to be able to see that performance happen. So unfortunately, life hit everybody very hard over the last several months, but at least just to give you a sense in terms of what these numbers mean. So to be able to give you at least a little sense in terms of how these kind of, how you can split these numbers into different ways. And I found this to be somewhat interesting in that I looked at how many programmed works, so how many programs had these works on in them. But then I also looked at if you got rid of the performances, got rid of the programs, and just had the list of titles, how many titles were by women composers. And then if you got rid of the works but just had the list of names, how many names were by women composers or composers from underrepresented heritages. And then underrepresented composers there on the right-hand side gives you a sense in terms of the combination of both composers of color and women composers combined. So you can see that this year, and this top row is what we'll be focusing on primarily. And I think that's the important one, because these are actually that's what's in the programs. Is this year it was at 8% if you looked at the entire 120 orchestras, 6% for underrepresented heritages, and 11% for the combination of the two. And this is what it looks like in a fancy bar graph. And so there's the same thing, 8%, 6%, and 11%, and then the other two, so you can see how these are growing. And also here on the right-hand side, I also wanted to look to see what did it look like if we just looked at living composers, irrespective of gender or racial and ethnic heritage. And you can see this was actually one of the fascinating things that I saw, is over 50% of the composers that were performed were by living composers, but only 16% of the programmed works. So that means that there are a lot of composers out there that are being performed. But as we will see in a bit, let's just say the old dead white guys are getting a lot more play. They're getting a lot more works being performed, and those works are being performed more often than the living composers, the underrepresented composers, the underrepresented composers from underrepresented groups, and the women composers. So that's kind of what this looks like. To also give you a sense in terms of context, this is what it looked like for this year, 2019, 2020. This is what it looked like 4 years ago. No, 3 years ago, excuse me, 2016, 2017. Boom. So you can see women composers were at 1% programmed works, and underrepresented heritages were only 2%. And all of those combined were at 3%. We'll go back and you can see just in those 3 years how much change there has been. And this is one of the things that I find really fascinating to see. Okay, obviously there is a change. Now, is that just a blip? Is it something that just happened this year? Or is it something that's actually going to be sustainable and hopefully will even move higher? So, as I mentioned, usual suspects. This is where we tend to run into issues when we're talking about programming. Doesn't matter whether or not we're talking about a solo violin concert, a string quartet concert, a wind band piece, or a wind band concert, or an orchestra concert, or a choral concert. Every genre has their canon, their group of composers that everybody goes to, everybody plays, all the audience members want to go see, and you just want to make sure that well, we'll get into that. So, by the way, here's from what I've been able to find. There's your usual suspects, or at least the ones that I've been able to the ones that were most performed this year. And you can see those numbers: 2%, 2%, 3%, 3.5%, 5% for Mozart, and 10.5% for Beethoven. Yes, I know that Beethoven's birthday kind of, goosed the numbers a bit. However, if I remember correctly, the Baltimore Symphony did something similar to this a few years ago. And the numbers that I was looking at, I think their numbers in terms of, I think they were looking at about 80 orchestras. And I think the Beethoven performance numbers were even higher back then. This was like 2016, 2015, somewhere around there. So actually that 434 might not be as high as it could have been had there not already been a shift towards more diverse programming. So let's see here. And this is what that looks like in kind of a nice bar graph, where all of these composers here on the right-hand side, those are a lot of your Mendelssohns, your Shostakoviches, your Dvorak's. And then this is what it looks like when you start comparing to those other numbers that we were looking at by underrepresented composers, underrepresented heritages, and women composers. So you have Mozart here at 210, and then you have all the composers of color at 228, or composers from underrepresented heritages. So there's just barely that many more composers from that entire demographic than Wolfgang. And then 319 works by women composers. And then here, this is what really is the kicker. You almost have as many works by Beethoven being performed in 2019, 2020 as you do all of the underrepresented composers, irrespective of gender or race. I know this has kind of hit folks a lot, pretty hard in terms when they've seen this, and it is kind of one of those challenges, because I totally understand having. I'm a saxophone player by trade, but I have also done a lot of conducting. I've conducted a number of Beethoven symphonies myself, and I understand the draw, and I understand why audiences want to go see works by Beethoven and Mozart and all of the usual suspects. The challenge is that when there's so many performances in that are focused on this group of usual suspects, these canonic composers, that it's really kind of it's creating a stranglehold for the entire thing, in order for us to make room for other voices that need to be heard. It's not all doom and gloom, though. For instance, we have one of the numbers that I was able to find as I was looking through these things is, as I mentioned, Baltimore Symphony did about 3 or 4 years of analysis, looking at about 80 different orchestras around the country for about 3 years. And in all 3 of those years, I think 2014 through 2017, there weren't any performances by historical women, women who weren't living at the point. They were all living women at that point. And so here, 2015, 2016, for example, 89 orchestras, 0 performances of historical women. Here's what it looks like this year. 61 performances, and some of them have quite a few. Clara Schumann has a number of works, a number of performances of her piano concerto. Florence Price has a lot of different performances. Obviously, Lily Boulanger had a really good year this year. And that's really fascinating that it's starting. I think folks are starting to remember that women composers didn't just start composing 30, 40 years ago. They've been doing it for a very, very long time. And the same thing would go for composers of color as well, that we have to look not just in a small bubble, but really kind of get out of the concept that music from the 18th century and the 19th century were basic. If we haven't heard of them already, it must not be good. This is something to keep in mind. There's a lot of really good music here that relatively few people know and relatively few audiences have heard. And so this is one area in which performers, whether or not they're chamber or ensemble, can help to move the needle a little bit. Okay, current repertoire. This is one of the strategies that I've been able to grow as I've been working with this, is to be able to provide resources by which it's not only just doing the analysis. It's great to be able to look at the bar charts and numbers and kind of complain about how bad it is. And yes, obviously it's very bad, and we hope to be able to make it better. But one of the ways to be able to make it better is to look at the current repertoire, to actually have a list, an aggregated list of all of the works. And this is what we have on our site on the analysis page. This is just for this year. I'm actually going to be looking at doing a longitudinal study for about 5 or 6 years, including this upcoming year, to get a list of all of the works by women composers and by composers from underrepresented racial, ethnic, and cultural heritages. This is just orchestra, but we also want to do this for others as well, to basically get a sense in terms of not just what is out there, but what are people already playing. Because I know, and any of you who have been on Facebook or Twitter know that oftentimes if you want to find a piece that you don't know about, you ask your friends and you get recommendations from others that you trust. This is one way to do that, to be able to say, hey, these are works that have been performed by at least one or more professional orchestra out there. And hopefully it will, I'd love to be able to see resources like this being used by other orchestras, by other musicians, to be able to get even more performances of these works. I mentioned that I'm looking at doing a longitudinal study. We've just started to take a look at what these look, and to give you a sense in terms of how things might look in the future. I've got a couple here. This is what the St. Louis Symphony looked like 2016, 2017. Here's your living composers, your women composers, and your composers from underrepresented heritages. And you can see 16, 17, 17, 18, not so good, especially over here on the right. Got a little bit better this past year, but then 2021, compared to what it was just a few years ago, it's obviously a fairly sizable leap, and we'd like to see that move even more so. And I would say the same thing with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, where the numbers were just a little bit better than St. Louis just a few years ago, and now they're looking quite good. And now the trick is to figure out how to be able to make that sustainable, so it's not just a blip. In the same way that Beethoven had a lot of performances this year, and will probably have them in the fall for the same reason, since this is his 250th birthday. But also, we had a lot of concern because a lot of orchestras were saying that they were playing a lot of women's works because it was the centennial for the 19th Amendment. And that's great to be able to get your foot in the door. But now the trick is, okay, can you just have that many women composers or even more, but not have to have a special year for it, right? It's just it's music that is really high quality, and it may be composers or maybe repertoire that folks might not know as well. And so this is a way for them to be able to do that. All right, I've got a little bit of time left here. I think we'll be good. So best practices. I love this because we've literally just been reworking these a little bit over the last week. But basically these 4 ideas, the idea of normalizing composers outside of the traditional canon. And in order to do that, you need to perform works by those underrepresented or composers from underrepresented groups throughout your season to normalize it, not just to put it on a special single dedicated concert, for instance, say black composers in February or women composers in March. I know from hearing from many, many composers from those groups, they hate that for many, many reasons, but it doesn't help if you just put them all on one concert and don't put them anywhere else. If you wanted to do that, maybe not in those particular months, but also to then have them spread out and have it much more of a balanced programming concept. That's a much more healthy and successful programming idea. To prioritize, making sure that this is something that is a priority at the get-go, not just an afterthought, but actually as you are building a season or a concert, to be able to intentionally plan for this and to actually say, I want to have, and we've created these windows of 15 to 25% for women composers, 25% and 15 to 25% for composers of color within each season as at least a goal to work for, because the numbers have been so pathetic. It's been 2 to 3% for many, many years in each of those groups on average. And so to think of it ahead of time as you're programming a concert season, or even just a concert, like I said here, even at least just one work for a singular event. If you have a concert, like a special festival concert, the idea of having an entire concert with just white guys, irrespective of whether or not they're living or dead, not so good anymore. Welcome to 2020. We should be doing better than that. The third one would be to amplify those voices by limiting the works per season by commonly performed composers, to not let Beethoven have as many works as all of the composers from underrepresented groups altogether. If you reduce the number of works by the usual suspects, so to speak, and make sure that 2 to 3 works, depending on the size of the season, you'll provide a lot more room to be able to bring in more voices and to be able to connect with your audience members, which is one of the really important things about this. It's not just that we're doing this on principle, which it's a good principle, but also we want, whether or not it's professional orchestras or professional ensembles, professional musicians, to connect with all of their audience members, not just members from one demographic, but also for educators to be able to connect with their students who happen to be women or students of color. You want to be able to have the music that they're performing, that they're learning, if it's in a let's say a music theory textbook, shouldn't just be all dead white guys. Hopefully you've gotten that point by now. And then one other thing that we've put here, it specifically comes out of what I've seen a lot in orchestral programming, but orchestral marketing, but it can easily be extrapolated out, is the idea of featuring the underrepresented composers or the composers from those underrepresented groups in your marketing material as visibly as you would publicize those really famous usual suspects. It's really, really frustrating if you have a premiere of a work by say a woman composer, and yet the marketing materials mention nothing about it whatsoever, and they just focus on say, I don't know, Tchaikovsky, because that happens to be on the concert as well. They should be making a huge deal of the fact that A, there's a premiere, and B, here's a composer that you haven't heard of and that you should come here. And oh, by the way, they are also women. They shouldn't necessarily be having that be full front, but at the same time, they shouldn't hide it as well. So, and these are just some things. This is what I was describing about the idea of 15 to 25%, 15 to 25%. We actually suggest 25 to 35% for living composers in terms of coming up with an entire, like a good balanced season. There's still plenty of room for the old dead white guys, but maybe a little less room in order to be able to give us music from these other areas. And here's just a couple things I had to point to that idea of limiting those works. You can see here how many orchestras had 3 or more works by all of these different usual suspect composers. Tchaikovsky, 12 orchestras, Brahms, 12 orchestras. 56 orchestras had 3 or more works by Beethoven, and I know I came up with a few, at least 2 that had 14 or 15 works by Beethoven in one season. That's a bit much. So if we reduce that, especially in the large orchestras, and here's kind of the group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, and then this last one is group orchestras that actually don't even belong to the League of American Orchestras. But it's that one on the far left. You can see how many works in the how many of those works were from these multiple programmings. And if all of those 3 or more works were avoided, it would have almost 500 slots across the seasons of all of those 120 orchestras to provide music by other composers. The last thing I would say in the 2 minutes I have left before we get to questions is just a list of some of the other things that we've been doing for a little while. We're creating our chamber and choral databases. We also hope to be able to look at music from, say, collegiate wind band and the military ensembles as well, and to be able, we have a strong initiative that we've got going on looking at state solo and ensemble lists, and that will be going on for a while, because once we're able to get those diversified, say even back into say middle school and high school, that will have a huge impact on basically the entire the idea of who are the composers and what are the works that are important. If they're included on these repertoire lists at the state level, that can have a huge impact. We've also got some playlists on Pandora and Spotify. We're going to be working on creating a discography, and we're also going to be working on focusing on disabled composers. We already have as you saw, a list, click or checkbox for LGBTQ composers. And yeah, we'll stop that there. I will stop sharing my screen here, and I will go back to our illustrious host, Peter, and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. That's great. We will be taking questions, so if you have any questions, please put those in the chat. To start off with, there's a question: what does underrepresented heritages include?
Right. So that is a term that we came up with. The idea of just saying composers of color felt. There's a lot of issues with that. The way that we look at it is that on our site, you're able to search for composers from many different regions of the world, in addition to their racial and ethnic heritage. And so, say, for example, South America, or what we would consider Latin America, including Mexico and Central America, there are a number of countries that many of the folks who have grown up there for years, many generations, were originally from Europe, right? So the idea that it wouldn't be appropriate to be able to call someone from one of those countries a person of color if technically, say, their great grandparents were from Italy, right? But that idea of coming up with a term that kind of is a catch-all that allows for us to be able to say, here are, if you want to find composers, initially for the databases, if you want to find composers from Latin America or who are Latinx in ethnicity, here's where they are. Same thing, you run into the same thing when you're looking at, say, North Africa or West Asia. It gets pretty dicey. So that's where we're going. I remember when we first did this, there were a lot of questions like, why can't we just say not white people? But that in and of itself got hairy very quickly. So there's probably never going to be a good term, like a perfect term, but at least at this point, it's a catch-all: racial, ethnic, and cultural heritages. And then as I'm talking, to kind of shorten that up into underrepresented heritages allows for me not to trip over my tongue too often.
Great, and this is all really, really helpful information. Everyone know that a couple of comments that everybody should see this. So we had one question: is this a slideshow that you could make available for people who are watching today?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll share it with Peter after the talk and make sure that you can get it.
Great, and we'll post that as a resource on our website so that you can come and get that. Super. So we have a couple more questions. What efforts are there to push diversification of rep to the organizations that you're including in this data? And how do you plan to use this platform database to do work to dismantle the inherent white supremacy in Western classical music organizations?
Read that one more time. I want to really make sure I get it because there was a lot of stuff in there.
Sure, yeah, there's two parts to the question, yep. Two questions. What efforts are there to push diversification of rep to the organizations that you're including in this data?
Yep.
That's the first part.
So let me answer that, and we'll do it piece by piece. So a lot of it has, to be honest, the first thing was just to literally put those bar graphs up on our page and to make that data available. When we first did that last year, it got a lot of attention by a lot of orchestras. It was one thing for other organizations who have done similar types of things, but similar types of studies, but usually they tend to just have like one big number, like 2% over the entire group of orchestras, as opposed to be like actually seeing where each of those orchestras fall within that. And then that's part of the reason why I want to do more of a longitudinal thing where you're kind of showing it over time to show orchestras how they're doing compared to themselves, but then also to be able to show them how they're doing compared to each other. Because I think, to be honest, the competitive nature of orchestras, and to be perfectly honest, all musicians, we don't want to look bad compared to what our colleagues are doing. And so that's one way to be able to do that. And we're also trying to work with many, many other organizations, both diversity within the diversity space, as well as organizations like the League, like College Band Directors Association, like National Association for Music Educators, trying to just work with them in as many different ways as possible to be able to move that needle. And hit me with the other question, because I know that's important as well.
Sure. How do you plan to use this platform database to do work to dismantle the inherent white supremacy in Western classical music organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the idea is initially to be able to provide the tools through which not just one person or not just one group, but all of us can do it over time. And I think that's the trick. The idea of you can have these spikes where everybody is really focused on it. And obviously the last 3 weeks have been one of those spikes. But I think the important thing is to be able to get as many people involved in this, and to be able to think of it not as just something that happens over the course of a month or even a year, but over 5 years, over 10 years, and just be stubborn as hell about it. It's also one of the reasons why we focus so much on K-12 and higher ed, because it's one thing to be able to hit the professional folks, but in order to really change mindsets, you kind of have to work with folks when they're young, and to be able to slowly over time be able to make that work. It's at least a way that I think these particular tools can help move the needle in that direction.
Great. It would be fascinating to see the percentage of works commissioned by orchestras from women and underrepresented composers versus white male composers. Any plans for that?
Yeah, that's one of the many things on our list. And once you start looking at these things and you start getting a bigger and bigger list of all of the things that you need to look at, I think the commissions, I think, is important. And to be perfectly honest, I would guess that, at least from what I've been seeing so far from this year and last year, it's getting much better than it was, say, a few years ago. So that instead of just having a snapshot of a year, I think it's going to be really important to get, say, like a 5-year idea of, okay, this is where we were, this is where we are, and this is where we need to get to.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that, though, is there is a lot of kind of very quick commissioning happening right now of composers that people feel like they should be commissioning, and
that checking of the box that I was mentioning before.
Exactly, and but with quick turnaround times too. Like, we really need a piece by a Black woman composer by next week so that we look okay. So that's also maybe not optimal. So anyway, another question. Also, is there data on what caused the changes, dramatic increases in some of the examples you provide?
We don't have data as of yet. That will take quite a while, I think, because each orchestra is different. Some of those orchestras, it depends on who's making the decisions and how. I remember from one of our studies that, like, the Philadelphia Orchestra a couple of years ago had a big brouhaha because they had basically no women composers whatsoever, and they quickly got their act together and were able to at least get 2 on their season, which wasn't great, but at least it was something. But then the following year, they brought in Gabriella Lena Frank, who is an amazing composer based out in San Francisco, and they brought her in as a consultant, not only scheduled her works this past year, but also had her work with them in order to be able to find more. And if you remember from that bar graph that I showed way back at the beginning, Philly was the only one over 15% this year. And I think it was a lot of it because of that particular collaboration. Now the trick is to see what can they do over time for, say, the next 5 years, and can they actually keep it up or even improve it? Or is it just kind of like, okay, we've done that for 1 year and then it goes away? That's what I'm really going to be looking at and hoping that we can nudge them against.
Great. We have one more question, and we have to actually make sure that we end right on time, because we have a fantastic day of other events coming up.
Absolutely.
Which I just posted about in the chat. So please do join us. Right immediately after this, we have a session with Flutronics, which I need to start. But just one last question, and this is great. Thanks to everybody for your questions, and thanks, Rob, for being here. Does conductor diversity affect the choices or variety of the programs?
I think in some ways it is, but I think that in and of itself is going to, I would say, both conductor and actually even soloist as well, because they're the ones who at least can have an impact on the decision making. And then I think over time, I think we are seeing that there are some conductors who've really made that a priority, and now the trick is just to be able to make it a priority across the board.
Great. Well, thanks to you, Rob, not only for joining us, but for all of the work that you're doing on this. I know that it's an incredible amount of work, but when you see it out there, you know, it's not just anecdotal. When you see the actual numbers, then it becomes clear that, you know.
Absolutely. And I would finish by saying that we have a wonderful page of advocates, not advocates for the Institute, but actually advocates for this work on our page. And there's a long list of other organizations who are doing this. And I would really, impress upon everyone, go check those folks out and go learn who the other groups are that are doing this stuff. I see Vanessa Rose in the audience, and I know American Composers Forum is one of those groups that is doing really, really good work. So go out, check out all of these different groups, and have fun checking out our databases.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks again to you and to everybody for joining and for the great questions. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what all of this information does for people and the way that they think and what we're all doing going forward. So take care. Hopefully I'll see all of you in 3 minutes to talk with Allison and Natalie from Flutronix. Thanks
Excellent.
again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.